CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode with me, Vuyiswa Sidzumo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the West Business School. I'm so excited today to be joined by Vuyiswa Sizdumo. Vuyiswa, welcome.
Thank you.
I've been wanting to have a chat with you, like a real conversation with you, because of most of the people that I've worked with, you're probably one of the few that understands this philanthropic space. In my view, I put it that way. So welcome to the Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Thank you.
Let's start with perhaps where we are today, the Ford Foundation. You're currently the leader of the Ford Foundation in Southern Africa office. What are the key areas that keep you awake at night as you think about the work that you do?
Sure. I guess it's the issue of how you reconcile the importance of the issues that we are focusing on at the moment as the Ford Foundation, in the region. But a constantly evolving world, basically, where things are not the same and things are not predictable, and how you hold that balance, because of course you have to have some strategic discipline around, focus areas on the one hand, but at the same time you keep having, issues that are coming up that may directly even impact on the work that you do. And because, you are bound by, having to do things in certain ways at times, then it makes it kind of tricky, to be able to respond to everything, which is also impossible, because we have a finite amount of resources, and the problems we are trying to solve, we are trying to contribute to them being solved, are themselves quite huge. So it's one of those things where I'm saying also, are we using the right tools for this world that we're living in? There's been so much that has been happening. There's rising authoritarianism around the world, and this region is not spared from that. There's, the issue of declining leadership across the board. Here we reminisce about, old leaders. We still fantasize about old leaders because of, the kind of leadership crisis we are faced with. And so on and so on. So those are the things that really keep me awake at night, to say, how can we do things differently? How do we find ways, both as the Ford Foundation, but also how does the sector find ways of being responsive to today's problems, using new solutions? It's almost like we're using old tools to solve new problems. So that's a lot.
So I guess I wanted to start there because I wanted us to go back a little bit to the background. Because before you joined the Ford Foundation, you were the director of the Mott Foundation office here in South Africa. Are there any lessons from that part of your time, or any experiences that really prepared you to do what you are doing today?
Yes, I would say so. I feel like I was fortunate to work for maybe let's say a small foundation that's also still pretty much a family foundation with grounded values, and there was a lot of values alignment between Mott and my own values. Instead, in terms of there was a lot of emphasis on people. We're not just doing this work for the sake of the work. You're trying to help people overcome difficult circumstances. So there was a lot of value to that. There was also a lot of prime given to how we conduct ourselves as people who are perceived to have power, because we come with the checkbook.
Yeah.
And so a lot of value was given to, kind of being humble about the work. Nobody told you this at Mott, by the way, but you knew that you kind of held yourself in certain ways when you were in spaces. Being able to listen, being able to learn all the time, and be guided by the people who are most impacted by the problems. So, so there was a lot of supporting work that's at the grassroots level, at Mott, even if we still funded it through intermediaries or bigger NGOs, because of course we didn't have the capacity to be supporting directly work at grassroots level. But there was a lot of emphasis on supporting people to solve their own problems, and to come up with solutions to their own problems. So I think that kind of really set me up quite nicely, because when I came to Ford, I had worked at Mott for more than 12 years. So those values were so entrenched in me that, I kind of brought them also to this space in terms of even just holding myself accountable. Because it's easy, and it can be a slippery slope about, wanting to insert yourself in other people's work. For an example, when we support organizations, I don't find it helpful to tell people what to do, but I find it helpful to be a sounding board for our partners. To be, when I'm invited to the spaces, I come in, as somebody who's invited, but also, with a large dose of humility that I'm not the one who holds the answers. Maybe the value I add is asking the right questions and getting people to think about things differently. And so I hold a lot of, what's the word? I value forming relationships. And that's something I learned at Mott, that when you do this work, you value relationships you form with your partners, because it's an iterative thing, while we may be the people, who provide in the resources, they are the people who are actually, they are the people that I really look up to, because they are the people who are at the coalface of solving real life problems. So yes, I think my working at Mott really set me up nicely, particularly for the role that I'm playing now at Ford, because as you know, I joined Ford as a program officer. Of course, it was still valuable, but also now as somebody who works with a team, those are the values that drive me, and those are the values that, I also share with the team. And I'm fortunate enough that I work with colleagues that also hold similar values.
Still at Mott, I think, if we could maybe talk about one or two of programs that, were dear to your heart. I know, I think there were some programs around the legal offices and stuff like that. Every time I used to come to the Mott Foundation to see you, I bet there will be either a conversation around those offices. Are there one or two programs or interventions that still today you look back and you realize actually you made a huge impact as the foundation?
So you're right. The work on access to justice, which was around supporting community-based advice offices, was something that, I still hold those advice offices very dear to my heart. And Mott's interventions there, I would say that, contributed significantly to the sector being still where it is. It's not at its strongest, but at the same time, it hasn't failed completely. So when I joined Mott, for an example, there had been funding that came, I think, from the Swiss, and it was ending. It had been a 10-year commitment to fund these community-based advice offices. But it had always been an agreement with the South African government that the funding would end after 10 years. But at the end of the 10 years, the government was still not ready to fund the sector. So we were faced with a situation where the sector could potentially collapse. So we worked in collaboration with a lot of the NGOs that worked directly with these community-based advice offices, the Foundation for Human Rights, Atlantic Philanthropies, and a couple of other funders, to help figure out how else we could continue to at least, make resources available for the work that was being done by these advice offices. It's a very long story.
Yeah.
But to cut the long story short, we then established an entity that at the time was called the National Alliance for the Development of Community Advice Offices. And after a couple of iterations, it's now called Community Advice Offices of South Africa, CAOSA. And to an extent, I think that has helped to at least make sure that these really, really critical institutions still get the resources they need, either financial or others in kind. So for an example, we would support law clinics that provided the backup legal services to these advice officers. So if cases needed to go to court, and so on and so on. So the sector didn't collapse. And I mean, I don't want to say that was just only a Mott. It was a collective. It was a collective effort, and Foundation for Human Rights played also quite a big role, because Foundation for Human Rights was also still receiving funding from the European Union to make available to the sector. But I think Mott hanging in there, for that amount of time, was probably one of the catalysts that made that sector survive. So, it's one of those things that I think was quite fulfilling for me.
And then of course, you said when you joined the Ford Foundation, you initially came in as a program officer, and then now you are the director and the representative of the office here. How was the leap from program officer to leading the institution? Most people, especially in the philanthropic sector, when that leap happens, they are either lifted into a position where all of a sudden there are huge challenges and expectations, and they've not been prepared for, or they actually get there and then they realize, I actually enjoy my program officer position more than I do this, because there's lots of administration and stress and all of those things. For you, how was it like? Because you are coming from almost this space where at the Mott Foundation, and even prior to that with the UN and others, you've been working basically with communities, and probably you've been alluding to some of the values that you were then were shaping you. So how was that leap for you?
Yeah. Remember, though, that I'd already gone through that leap at Mott.
Yeah.
Because I joined at Mott. Actually, I joined Mott as an associate program officer, then was program officer, then became the director of the office. But the advantage at Mott was that we were small, so I could still make grants while I was also directing the office. So at least I wore both hats, which is, I think, the best job in the world. Because I could still interact with communities, I could still be out there, and but while still doing the representational work, because a lot of that involved just representing Mott in the country. And then when I came to Ford and became program officer, I just wanted to spend more time out there, being in communities, being with change makers, and so on. But I think it slowly crept in, after I joined Ford, because you would know that my predecessor, Nicolette, then was asked to play two roles at Ford. And so she asked me to work with her as her deputy, because she was, she had double the work, basically. And, and I thought, okay, I've done this before, why not, And so I got into the role, and of course, then later on applied when Nicolette left, applied for the position of director. I must say, being a program officer is possibly the best job in philanthropy. Let me just put it out there. Because honestly, especially when you exercise your power in the right ways, and you don't abuse, the power that you hold. But I've been lucky that I work with an amazing team. You've met them. So I kind of saw my role over time. Then even when I was still acting director, I kind of realized that while I'm not directly a program officer, I'm still used by colleagues as a thought partner, problem solver, and everything in between. So it has not been that difficult because and we have a very vibrant program team, within the office where we discuss literally every single grant that is made out of this office.
Yeah.
It's not, while program officers have the, kind of like the agency, to make grants without really having to get inputs from everybody. We have chosen to do that collectively. So you can ask anybody who's in the program team about any grant in the office and they will have something to say about it.
Yeah.
So it's a really fun way of working. It means it's a lot of work, of course, because it almost like doubles the work for everyone, but it's very fulfilling.
Yeah.
And everybody has a voice. So when we get together, everybody has a voice, can ask questions, we debate, we kind of sharpen people's thinking about the grants that they are making. So in that way, it's kind of been really, really fun. And so just really working in this kind of environment with this team. And I also have very supportive bosses, I must say. Who also, kind of help sharpen my own thinking. They ask difficult questions, which I really appreciate. And so, it hasn't been as bad, but still.
Yeah. So for most civil society organizations, I mean, you support a lot of them. I mean, I was at the Southern Africa Trust before. Succession is usually a very difficult thing. And it sounds like yours was, it wasn't as difficult as it would have been if not handled properly. So maybe we talk a bit about some thoughts around succession planning, because that, I think, is something that we rarely talk about, but it's a big issue in the sector. So it seems as if the system accepted you, but other people are rejected by the system immediately. And there are so many factors really that play or rather come into play when it comes to succession. In the case of you succeeding Nicolette, what are some of the key factors that you think helped to make it successful?
I mean, you know that I had to apply for the job, so it wasn't a given, right? So, but what made it easier was that, I mean, I was already in the system. I'd already been working with colleagues. We had created very effective ways of working. So I guess, the team was succeeding as a team. And I'm trying to think back about some of those things, and that maybe the leadership looked at when they were appointing me. And I mean, I knew the programs already. I know Ford Systems, I know Philanthropy. So I can only assume that those were the things that also added value, because then they didn't need to be starting from scratch, because I mean, anybody could have filled in this role, didn't need to come from a philanthropy background, but I've worked in philanthropy and US philanthropy at that. So I know it quite well. So making grants is easy, for the office. So I think, and also because, for the year that I was acting as a director, things really went well, I want to assume. And so possibly then the leadership saw the potential of what I would bring, and I had the support of colleagues as well.
So for you then, that year of deputizing and acting is probably one factor that maybe we could take out and say to some of the institutions, it's not a solution, but it could be one of the ways in which succession can be managed. Like really putting, like the second tier leaders into that space where they can grow into the position. And then later on, when they are given the reins to lead, then they can lead.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Deputizing is definitely, I think, something I've seen also in others, in our partner organizations, how that has worked and where it's been successful. So if you're looking for an example at organizations like Section 27, where there was a very, successful transition from Mark to Umunyana, you look at Seri, where there was transition to Nomzamo, so, but those were very deliberate. You look at CER, for an example, the most recent in our case, one of our partners, where Melissa got Wandisa on board early on, and she worked as a deputy, I think actually for more than a year, for about 2 years, if not longer.
Yeah.
And so the transition was much more thoughtful, was much more deliberate. And of course, as you said, because the system can reject you, those people the system had already accepted. So I guess to an extent, you're right. I mean, I haven't thought about it in that way before, but I think you make an important point there.
I mean, it doesn't work all the time. But,
of course.
But I suspect, with the cases that we have seen, it seems to really solve a lot of the unplanned challenges that come with succession planning. True. But anyway, let's come to the Ford Foundation. I'm trying to think how many people have been directors of the Ford Foundation in Southern Africa.
So do you want to go? It was okay. I don't
so
know.
We started Gerhard with Jerry, Alice, Peter, Ahmad, Nicolette. So you're the seventh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the seventh. And you have the mammoth task of celebrating the office presence here, 30 years of existence. What have been the key moments of the Ford Foundation's physical presence here for the last 30 years?
Yeah. I mean, I think Ford has been constantly one of the biggest supporters of human rights work, if you look at it broadly speaking, just human rights work in the region for a very long time. You would know that Ford was one of the first funders of institutions like the Legal Resources Center, the Center for Applied Legal Studies at VETS, and we still support those organizations to this day. So I think a lot of Ford's history revolves around issues related to human rights. Of course, over the years, that has translated to different themes depending on what's topical. So Ford had a huge program, a huge HIV program, for an example, at the peak of the epidemic. It has had an education program, livelihoods program. So it's kind of, evolved over the years. But even as we were, kind of changing strategy, for an example, a couple of years ago, one of the things that I kept, reflecting with leadership around was there are things that Ford cannot afford to drop, right? Because I mean, a lot of the work around human rights, for an example, it's not sexy work, and that work is still largely funded externally. Of course, now there are local funders, that also support human rights work. There's been an increase in that as well, which is really, good to see. So to an extent, so there are those anchor organizations that we've funded through different iterations that respond to social justice, human rights issues, regardless of how they come up, So, and for me, this was crystallized during COVID, when you had even the state institutions violating rights, people being evicted illegally by some cities, and so on and so on. People have, not having, kind of access to treatment, and those kinds of things. But you had these mainstay human rights organizations rising to the occasion even during that time. So it's one of the things that has kind of been the common thread, I guess, with Ford, that you have these institutions that work to uphold rights, regardless of which rights are being violated, that have been supported throughout, regardless of the thematic areas that the foundation supports. And I think, the question also links to what you were saying earlier then about what keeps me awake at night. Because, again, it's that constant, well, how do I put it? I'm always asking myself if we are still being relevant and responsive.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things that, we're in this space. How relevant can we continue to be? How topical should we, can we continue to be? And I'm thinking even as I'm talking. And I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you have, but I want us to maybe take particular themes one goal at a time. So, as you were coming in here, you were telling me about the email that you received this morning from Waterford, where, after seeing the invitation to take part in the celebrations of the 30th presence here, somebody says, wait a minute, actually Ford's impact goes way beyond the 30 years. And the email is just detailing a beautiful story about how Ford supported Waterford in Mhlaba in around 1969.
Yeah.
And as we know, both of us know that the first grant to South Africa was in 1953.
Yeah.
And so that means the Ford Foundation has really been one of the key players in this country, but in the region as well.
Yeah.
And so there's the theme of human rights, which you have detailed very well. But there's also other themes, I think, around, for example, education.
Yeah.
When one looks at the trends in terms of the grants that the Ford has given to institutions of higher learning, you actually see a huge trend that there's been so much focus by the foundation in supporting institutions of higher learning.
Yeah.
Your VETs, your UCTs, University of Zimbabwe, Namibia, research specifically. So there's been a lot of attention to knowledge generation, as well as funding even fellows or individuals, supporting ideas and institutions. So maybe we can look at that area of institutions and ideas, and maybe speak to some of the key things that stand out for you. If you were to stand up on the day, 26th of October, you are celebrating 30 years, and you just want to pick one or two things out of institutions and ideas, what would those be?
Sure.
I know there might be many.
Yeah.
The history is,
I guess,
big.
that will also be informed by the research you're doing, in terms of, because I know Ford's history, but I don't know it to the extent that I'm excited about the research we're doing now about at least the past 30 years. But some of the things, that come up for me would be, kind of anecdotally, where you hear people to say, oh, I was a Ford fellow. And I remember some years ago, Franklin Thomas was visiting the country. I was still working for the Mott Foundation at the time. And I was invited to a dinner at the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund that was done by the chair at the time, Dikgang Moseneke, honoring Frank Thomas for the contribution that Ford has made in the region, So, and it was really nice because I think Dikgang Moseneke himself was a fellow. So you kind of hear these really great stories from people who were Ford fellows, people who received grants from Ford. So so I think those are some of the things that come up for me. And I've heard a lot of stories about the LRC, for an example, and Ford's involvement in the setup of the LRC at the time. I think it was Arthur Chaskelson as one of the founding members of the LRC at the time. So and I think on education, for an example, there's been two strands, remember. So Ford funded education for education's sake, but we also still have a huge number of grants to institutes within universities that support work that's kind of aligned to our priority areas. So in fact, a most recent example of really something that was really heartwarming for me the Chancellor of Vets, Dr.
Judy
Dlamini,
Dlamini,
yes, established an organization called Female Academic Leadership Fellows or something like that, FALF,
yeah.
for short. And so when she, I mean, you would know that, you know, she started it off with even her own family resources, and then, you know, kind of approached a few funders to come on board. And at the time, we made a small grant of $50,000. And then the grant was recently renewed. So they had a full day event with the fellows. And my colleagues Nikki and Lerato attended that one. I attended the evening event.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just amazing to be in the midst of these amazing women.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Nikki was saying some of the stories that were shared during the day about, I mean, the fellowship has been around for what, under 3 years? But some of them have been promoted in their jobs, which is one of its intentions to, you know, kind of lift up female academics, you know, to be, you know, kind of to be recognized in their roles, to do more research, to, you know, so that, and the fellowship allows them to take time out, to, you know, do different things. And so, you know, it's kind of, you know, one of those things, but because it's also linked, so for instance, one of the things that is done, which is why we are even supporting it even now, is that there's some of the research fellows are doing work around gender-based violence. So that's our interest. So our interest is, you know, while it's quite small, I think it's already had quite the impact. And I mean, as you know, Judy is amazing herself. But it was just really something to see.
So the space is very, very small. These guys actually covered the entire symposium for FALF.
Okay. No, Nikki and Lerato were just so blown away. It was an amazing day.
So they covered it, and I was asking them actually about it just before we started shooting. And as you know, Kira, also our former staff member, was part of that program. So she's one of the successful stories of that program, who has actually gone over now to teach in North America. So those are some of the, like, you know, stories here and there that I think are so fascinating. At one time, the Ford Foundation was the second biggest American foundation in Africa, after the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Things might have changed, I'm not so sure, I haven't checked the statistics. But that on its own really tells us the amount of impact that the foundation ought to be playing or has already played. I was talking to Jerry the other day, and he was telling me also, like, stories about also his time as the rep here. One of them relating to the time when he was invited to meet with the former President Nelson Mandela. And Mandela was thanking him on behalf of the Ford Foundation for the work that the foundation has done in the country, including contributing to the Constitutional Court. So maybe we can talk a bit about the work that the foundation has done in the legal fraternity.
Sure. I mean, I know that we contribute, because remember, these predate me, these incidents. So I know that before '94, Ford supported the IEC. So if we look at the kind of the landmarks of South Africa's transformation, so I think Ford made kind of massive grants to the IEC at the time. And I've heard those mentioned quite a number of times, because there were quite a few. I think Mott as well was one of those funders that supported that work, along with, of course, supporting voter education efforts and so on and so on. The Constitutional Court, I think, has been funded for various things, like the setting up of the court itself. You know, I mean, I know that things like the artwork, I know Ford, Atlantic, Mott, so I wouldn't know whose funds went to what. But those were some of the funders that supported just even the institution itself, you know, in terms of just the aesthetics of it. And Ford also supports, still to this day, a Franklin Thomas Fellowship for clerks. There are some law students. I think they, no, not students rather, but candidate attorneys who clerk at the court. And some of them then get scholarships now to go and study abroad. And I think Ford had also supported some of the work related to those clerks, the legal clerks to the Constitutional Court justices. So, but I stand to be corrected. So those are some of the work.
Yeah.
But and I know that with the fellowships, there was a lot of fellowships that went towards the kind of people who are in the legal fraternity in South Africa.
Yeah.
I think when you talk to Alice, she will probably have more on that because I think that most of that was done during her time.
I mean, the grants actually show they show like a whole history of that. So it's unfortunate that we are not able to show it here, but the grants actually show the amount of effort and impact that went into the legal fraternity, including the training of judges, some of them taken overseas in preparation for the democracy in South Africa and the writing of the constitution, among others. And again, maybe when I speak to Alice, there's a time between 1993 up to 1996 where you see a huge spike in support of government, institutions, simply because of the context in which you were.
Exactly.
But I'm also keen to know your thoughts about the future. You are currently overseeing a strategy of the Ford Foundation. What does it seek to achieve, and what are your thoughts going forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, the current strategy is, has two pillars basically. And you know that the overarching theme for Ford is ending inequality, right? Fighting inequality. So all the work that we do is premised on the understanding that we are in an unequal world. So whatever we do is around, kind of chipping away at that. So the thematic areas at the moment for the Southern Africa office are gender-based violence, which is, I mean, South Africa is known as the rape capital of the world. Nothing to be proud of. The statistics are kind of,
Alarming.
really alarming, really bad in terms of gender-based violence. So that's one of our key pillars of the strategy. And the other one is on natural resources and climate change, which covers, kind of a number of areas, including around community rights, when it comes to natural resources, for an example, whether to consent or say no to extraction. We've been doing a lot more work now around the issues of the just energy transition. And our interest there is on the issue of the justness of the transition, because, I mean, as you would know, we're still talking about the same systems of power that are operating even as we talk about the just energy transition. And, I think people, we've been talking about how do you change that? This is an opportunity for us to change how we usually do things, So how do we make sure that the just element is not left behind as we transition and into a more environmentally sustainable future. So those are the main thematic areas. But of course, we're not blind to our context. So we do this work, of course, in relation to the context in this region, particularly with a large focus on South Africa. Yeah.
And some of course, the Ford Foundation's work also stretches, like you said, outside South Africa to countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia. So are there some of the groups that you might want to speak to or speak about, especially around the issues of, I think, the just transition and the climate, the climate-related work? I think last week, there's a huge conference on Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. And some of the groups that I know, some of them might be partners are taking part in there. So beyond South Africa, who are some of the partners that the Ford Foundation has been supporting across the region?
So we I mean, yeah, we work, the large part of our grant making is in South Africa, then Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
So we have some partners in Mozambique as well. But, and then I think maybe just one in Namibia.
Yeah.
But a lot of the work, though, is regional. So if you're looking at the work, for an example, that we support with the Southern Africa Trust, it's quite regional.
Yeah.
And they re-grant to small groups across the region on issues of climate change. The Southern Africa Litigation Center is another example.
Yeah.
They even have a presence in Eswatini, Zambia, Malawi, you know, and so on. So the work of our partners reaches many countries in the region. I mean, some of our strongest partners, I mean, in for instance, in Zimbabwe, particularly around the issue of the energy transition, would be there's women in law in Southern Africa, the Zimbabwe chapter, very strong, particularly on the gender piece, because part of what's forgotten is that also even climate change does not affect men and women in the same ways. You know, so there's a disproportionate burden on women around issues of climate change and energy transition. So, so these are partners that work to elevate, you know, those disparities, and just to really get us to be a bit more conscious about how this affects women more, and the things that can be done, you know, to address that. So, so those on energy transition, that's the one of the main partners for us in Zim.
So one of the things that stands out as I'm looking through the grants is this introduction of the build concept.
Yes.
When Ford decided to invest to strengthening institutions, which is really about also addressing the issue of inequality in a way. And I'm aware that, you know, you've been giving specific grants, build grants to specific institutions in the region. How has that program, how has it succeeded? I mean, what are the lessons that you are pulling from that program? What are the challenges that you still see that affect most institutions? Because I know, because at the Southern Africa Trust, when I was there, we were actually a candidate of that grant. And as I studied it, I was so fascinated by what the Ford Foundation was seeking to achieve, starting with just making sure that, you know, you plan very well, you have a strategy, you've got resources, you've got personnel, you've got systems, all the way until financial sustainability. It looks good.
Yes.
It looks really good. But what has been the outcome?
Largely positive. I mean, if I just talk about our group of partners in the region, it's because at the core of Build is about really enabling organizations and leaders to do their work, you know, and be creative and be responsive to context, and without the burden of worrying about where the next grant is going to come from, at least, you know, in such a way that it makes them not sleep at night. So the fact that Build is 5 years, at least it gives people that break, and it enables people not to be projectized into everything. It enables innovation, it enables creativity, because a large part of the grant is about, you know, kind of general support. So people can respond to their contexts in real time with the funding, because it's not projectized. So they haven't promised Ford that we will deliver this store, and then the next day they realize that, you know, no, actually we need the window. You know, so they are able to respond. Of course, there are some things that are a constant, you know, that they would continue to work on, but they are also able to be responsive to context. If the first year of the Build grant is a planning year, and you know, we have a process which helps organizations just really figure things out, and ask them a lot of questions about systems, structure, processes, and so on. And then after that first year, then they develop the proposal for the 4 years, for the additional 4 years, where they then, because then that exercise in that first year kind of elevates the weaknesses within the organization. So it also enables organizations to strengthen their systems. For an example, one of the things that a lot of people reflected on when I would talk to them around something that they had a blind spot around was around security.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of organizations that are working on very sensitive areas around human rights, particularly, in places like Zimbabwe. But they hadn't really thought through issues related to security, even including like digital security, physical security, and so on. But the process that they go through in that first year enables them to kind of really interrogate everything about how they are doing, and it talks to everybody in the system, all staff members, board members, you name it, and then it's through that process that they then develop what then they think would positions the organization for the following 4 years. Just a couple of anecdotes. We've had one where kind of not as good an example, but where I think the organization then became overly dependent on Ford.
Yeah.
But of course, in these kinds of things, it's still worth the lesson, right? Even if it doesn't go the way intended. But in the majority of cases, it's helped, organizations to really move forward, are able to get more resources. You are talking about issues of succession planning. It has enabled succession planning as well, because then you don't have the new director coming into an organization that doesn't have sufficient resources. And you would know, particularly in South Africa, a lot of the transitions have been from white men to black women. And when they then, because fundraising is about relationship building. Now, when these black women who don't have these relationships with the funders and networks come in, and they are not able to raise the kinds of resources that are needed, of course, who gets blamed, right? And so that can be seen as a failure of transitions. So for us, that's one of the things it has enabled, because then, you have a leader that has at least a couple of years of, kind of at least committed funding. And of course, it doesn't mean that they don't start, but at least it gives them the lead time to establish relationships and so on. And where organizations have been faced with really difficult time and funders walking away, that has kind of, the Build grant helped, because hard times sometimes, it's life, right? So we don't walk away because they are hard times. So we work with organizations to recover, and there have been instances like that. I can think of at least 2 or 3 instances where organizations really, really went through difficult times, and the Build grant was what enabled them to come out looking good on the other side. So for us, it really has been a positive experience, I must say.
So one of the things that I'm picking up in, I think as I grow older and I start looking at philanthropy differently, I see things a bit differently now. So the issue of dependence for me is no longer an issue anymore. Because I see now, as I look at some of the grants that the foundation has given and the groups that it has supported over years, one could look at them and say they're dependent. But actually, when I look at them, it's more of a co-creation or a journey that the foundation and those organizations have decided to go on over a long period of time. And I see lots and lots of cases like that. So previously, I would have looked at it and said, this is dependency. But I'm completely rewriting my script now, because I'm realizing that actually it's a journey that needs to be traveled together. If you leave the other behind, you are already, in a way, manipulating the outcome. You need to have both or more institutions traveling or supported by the foundation for a long period of time, because some of the social problems we are dealing with require longevity. And so the issue of dependency is a now contested one now in my head a lot.
Well, there's dependency, right? So you don't want Ford to fund 100% of your operations because it's not a Ford organization, right? And it then brings to question issues of then autonomy on your part if you are the organization who's being funded 100% by Ford. So if an organization is, let's say, 80-90% dependent on Ford, that's very worrying, because we also don't want to be almost like the
Yeah.
owners.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It kind of,
Yeah.
if I'm being cynical
Yeah.
of this organization. But you're right. In terms of, there are organizations who would never be able to generate income. They're not going to be able to have cake sales and things like that, where there will always be some level of donor support.
Yeah.
But I think what we're talking about is these organizations being too reliant on Ford only as their only funder,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, but Ford can partner with organizations for many years. But this changes over time, because as Ford changes strategies and so on, then, sometimes then we may stop funding organizations
Yeah.
because we're changing
Yeah.
strategies. They may be focusing on things that are no longer in line with, current priorities and so on and so on. But I'm like you. For me, the issue of maybe it's not it's not dependence, but it's largely continuity. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
even at Mott, the organizations were funded for more than 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if Ford has ever not funded LRC, for instance, since 1979.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
even before Ford came to South Africa.
Yeah.
And there's been value in that support
Yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
work that the LRC
Yeah.
does. So,
Yeah.
so you're right, but at the same time, though, the only thing I
Yeah.
would say differently is that you don't want over reliance
On one
on
institution.
one
yeah.
institution.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're about to wind down, and part of what I really want to know is at what point did you really realize you were destined to be in the philanthropic space?
At none. My life has just been a series
Yeah.
of coincidences.
Yeah.
Literally.
Coincidence. Yeah.
Literally, I have a master's in biochemistry.
Yeah, yeah.
Figure that
Yeah.
out.
And here you are leading
And here
a
I
philanthropic
am.
organization.
And
yeah.
it's been quite a journey, and I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to say more?
No.
No?
It's I asked that question because I know your background. You
Yeah.
are in biochemistry, and here you
Yeah.
are, leading this institution. But you've also been one of the people that has really supported and walked a journey
Yeah.
with most institutions in the philanthropic space. We could go back to institutions that you used to work with at Mott, Hlomeli Kusasa, and others till today. And in my case, you believed in an idea of a center on philanthropy when you were still at Mott.
Yeah.
And here we are today.
Yeah.
And the center is now in its 5th year.
Yeah.
We-
Only 5th year?
Yeah, only.
Wow.
Yeah, only 5th year.
I mean,
So, but I want to end there because I want to ask you, what is it about you that makes you don't want to be in the limelight?
yeah.
You want to be in the background all the time, but in that background you are making impactful moves.
So what's the question there?
What is it about you?
I mean, as my colleague and friend Otto normally says, one should never exaggerate their relevance. So I
Yeah.
think that's the first thing. I don't want to exaggerate my relevance. And I don't know, I was raised to be humble. I think my grandmother, amazing woman, raised me to be humble. So I don't really think that it's necessary to take credit for everything.
Yeah.
Lerato will tell you that I always say that I like working with people who are smarter than me. So why not get people to assume roles and get the credit for it?
Yeah.
If mine is to be that catalyst in the background, because I guess that's where I'm most effective, when I'm behind the scenes catalyzing others to be at their best.
Yeah.
If that's not if that's not how it is, that's something I always strive for. So I really don't think that I'm that relevant. I
Yeah.
think the people that I support are the ones who are relevant.
Yeah. So you give a lot. You are the probably the biggest philanthropist in the room. So the last question, well, maybe not even a question, but it's like the contribution that you have made, and I wouldn't end this conversation without mentioning it. There's been a growth of the ecosystem in Africa in terms of philanthropic institutions, your Africa Philanthropy Networks, your Africa Philanthropy Forums, or East Africa. I mean, there are so many of them. You've been patient,
Yeah.
very, very patient.
Yeah.
You have so much belief in Africa.
I do.
And it's important for us to say this, because if you didn't have the patience that you have, I think a lot of groups would not have survived to where they are, because there have been moments where it has literally been you and a few other donors just calling us to the room and saying, can you please get your house in order? And I wanted to make that because it's important for the philanthropy sector, especially the Africa philanthropy sector, to understand the role that you and several others have been playing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
you.
Sis Vuyi. Thank you so much for gracing us, for having this conversation. We wish you the best, and we know you are going to continue, praying for us as the center, supporting us as we grow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For having me.
That was Vuyiswa Sidzumo, the current director and representative of the Ford Foundation office in South Africa. Thank you for watching. See you next time.